My name is Crystal DiMichelli, and I'm an environmental educator and the host of the Healthy Seas podcast, a new show all about the people who are working to make sure that the oceans and seas thrive from above and below the waves. We're so excited to join you tonight for the European Researchers Night, which is a Europe-wide public event that aims to bring research and researchers closer to the public, promote excellent research projects across Europe and beyond, increase the interest of young people in careers in science and research, and showcase the impact of researchers' work on the public's daily lives. The work that's being talked about here is so inspiring, and it brings us so much hope for all of the great things that we're able to accomplish towards a better world. One of the topics that we're discussing today is marine pollution. And it's projected that by 2050, there'll be more plastic in the sea than fish. And as dire as a situation as this is, the ocean poses unique challenges in its cleanup because objects sink. So out of sight, out of mind. But marine pollution is not out of mind for our guest today. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Milne. He's a conservation biologist specializing in drone-based studies of natural landscapes. He's working on a project that's called Coasts Untangled, in partnership with Ghost Diving Greece, and funded by the Global Ghost Gear Initiative. Hi, Sol, welcome.
Hi, Crystal. Great to be here, and honored to be part of the European Researchers Night.
So tell us, what's the aim of Coasts Untangled?
So Coasts Untangled is a really exciting new collaborative project based around using drones, so aerial imagery, to try and understand the scale of the ghost gear problem in Greece. It started out as a collaboration with Ghost Diving about how and where we can use drones to survey large areas for lost fishing gear. And started out the conversation with Pascal van Erp, the director of Ghost Diving. I'm talking about how we can potentially use this technology, which we've applied in other different sites in the tropics, and see which chapters maybe would be possible to test us on with Ghost Diving. And so we got in touch with Nikos Vardakas, who's the director of Ghost Diving Greece. And he said the waters here are absolutely beautiful and clear, and it was a good place to start. So we've been surveying, we've done about a month's work of surveying all across the Aegean coast so far.
That's really cool. So I imagine that there's a lot of challenges, though, that you come across when you're trying to take aerial photos of the sea. So, I mean, first question that comes to mind is the water actually clear enough to see deep?
It's incredibly clear, and it's amazing because I spent the last year working in the Maldives, and I thought the water couldn't get any clearer. But actually going in for my first dive when I came to Greece, I didn't realize how properly crystal clear it is. The visibility is amazing, but it's difficult for a drone because when you're underwater and you're looking straight forward horizontally, you can see a very large distance. But from above, you're looking directly down. So whatever you have on the bottom creates kind of a distorted image. So the sort of landscape and scenery in the areas where we were surveying is very beautiful because you have a lot of sort of large boulders and sort of canyons. It's a very sort of like scenic landscape, also with a lot of seagrass. But that's actually quite a complex environment when it comes to actually looking at the aerial image. So that's one of the challenges we had compared to other sites. So before we were working with an NGO based in Myanmar, the Myanmar Ocean Project, and it's incredibly clear, sandy bottoms, which is sort of ideal for looking for this kind of gear because there's a contrast between the gear you can see and the sand below it. Whereas the environmental surveying in Greece are a lot more complex. And so the first challenge is trying to differentiate between what's net and what is initially seagrass. Nikos and I were going through images for ages, and my mind is set to thinking anything that's brown is a net. And be like, nope, that's seagrass, still seagrass, a crack in the rock. So I had to sort of reconsider my whole understanding of what a net looks like. And actually being able to go into the water and see this myself with the team was really useful. So it's very, very clear water, and it's a beautiful place to see, but it's definitely been a challenge from a drone surveying perspective.
So then how are you able to verify that
So
what you're seeing is a net or grass or whatnot.
exactly, that's a really important part of the research. So the great part about working with ghost diving is they are an incredible team of technical divers. And working with ghost diving Greece are based in Navisos. And so when that's sort of where we sort of centered most of our aerial surveys, we pretty much covered everything down from Navisos all the way down to Sunio, which is a very large distance, maybe about close about 20 kilometers down. So it was a really large area. And it was great because if we decided, okay, we surveyed one area, we want to go underwater and check what we've seen, we do what we call a transect. So in the dive center, Nikos has a DPV or dive propulsion vehicle, sort of an underwater scooter. And it means that you can do a transect of 1.5 kilometers. The strange tangent here is actually this transect methodology is based directly out of orangutan research. Because before I was doing this, my PhD was based on orangutan research. And there's a very big overlap in terms of the drone technology and the ground truthing that goes into this. So if you do 1.5 kilometers on the ground in the area where you surveyed, you can actually verify what you're seeing along that area. And if you use a long enough distance, you're bound to find something. And so, before we're looking for orangutan nests, now Nikos is going along with a scooter and making a note of every single net and debris it comes across. And we fixed a GoPro on top of the scooter, so we can actually record everything we come across, and it keeps a very steady field of view. And there was a big disparity between what we could see underwater versus what we could see from above. And it meant that when there was an overlap, when we could see something from the air, we could actually go check it underwater as well. So we're able to sort of kill two birds with one stone, really check what we're seeing from the air and also log the amount of dive gear, amount of ghost gear that was present in these areas.
And then I imagine there's some sort of algorithm that you then program, so you don't always have to ground truth.
Yeah, exactly. So we're working on that, trying to see like the differences between what kind of gear you find from above versus from below. So it's usually the really big gear we see from above. And we so a lot of time we found things like large gill nets, and gill nets are quite a pervasive, quite a deadly kind of ghost gear when it comes to entanglement, because they're very large mesh. But they also have a series of buoys right across the top, and that means they generally float at the surface. So the large open nets you can see from the drone. We've got an image I can share of one of these nets which has been sort of half stranded in water. But ones that are fragmented underwater have a very weird sort of structure, because they have these buoys at the top, but then they get caught around a rock. They sort of end up hanging, which means that they end up like almost like a little ghost. So they're hanging sort of like wraith-like in the water, but from above you can't see them to the very small surface area. But when you're going underwater, you can see them straight away. So so we're working on developing some algorithms to actually identify this gear aerially, not so much from underwater, but from sort of to sift through the images we get from a drone and actually find out which ones may contain this gear, even if it's actually very difficult for an observer to see in the photo. Yeah.
Is there anything that could go wrong with this type of work?
Absolutely everything can go wrong.
Everything can go wrong.
Yeah, flying a robot over the water is never never easy. So it's actually, so we've been doing this for a long time, the drone research, mostly in the forest before, and working for past 4 years doing this in marine environments. And first of all, you don't want to crash the drone into the water. I've only done that once, and it wasn't on this project. But it doesn't bode very well for the drone. So first of all, there's a lot of safety that goes into these surveys. So before we do the flight, we check whether there's any planes in the area. We get our permissions sorted. We make sure that the area itself we're surveying is very clear. And in order to do these surveys and get sort of the really good light conditions, we go excruciatingly early in the morning. And so Nikos is an absolute saint for waking up at about 5:30 in the morning, and we drive out to the field site and then assess the area. And that was a really good part about sort of the collaboration with ghost diving, because there's from what I can tell, the huge amount of the culture with these dives, the technical dives, is safety and situational awareness. And so you have to really assess the environment you're in and know that it's always changing. And so even in sort of sometimes half awake format in the morning, we'd actually be going out and we'd be looking through every sort of tangent that could go wrong and just assessing the environment each time. So we know if there's, any birds come to investigate the drone, or if it gets too windy. We're sort of constantly investigating what's going wrong. And example, wildlife interactions are a really important part of what we do. If we find that an animal is changing its behavior in response to a drone, bring the drone back. And that's sort of the rule of thumb for wildlife observations. And that's great because we did see quite a lot of wildlife in the images. And in general, when the wind picked up more than 20 miles per hour, we bring the drone back straight away as well. That's a good way to lose it. And with the dives as well, there's a huge amount of safety protocol that goes into play when we do the transects. So there's plenty to go wrong, and it's all been good so far. But yeah, in previous projects, there's been very high winds. I've lost one drone over the water, and at that point, it's very hard to get back. Although they can be repaired in salt water, surprisingly. Yeah, it's very much sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry. I was just going to say they could repair a drone, but they can't repair a phone that gets wet by some water.
Yeah, exactly, right? The irony. Yeah. Yeah, we went with a drone. You just got to drench it in fresh water, and apparently it will come back to life again. But I think I'll have to see it to believe it, I think. But yeah, so far it's been going very well. And yeah, so there's plenty that can go wrong, but it's sort of constant observation and just recognizing it's a very fluid situation. And one thing we do is always make sure the propellers are tightly on before we set the drone off. So yeah, that's sort of the first rule of thumb. After that, most of it will be okay.
And so what are the next steps for this project?
Well, I'm going back out in a couple of weeks, back to Greece, and we're going to continue doing some surveys and to look at some of the sites that have already been flagged as potentially containing ghost gear. So we're going to do more surveys and try to assess from what we've already done, which areas are likely to have high densities of gear. We've also kind of flagged which fishing practices might be more responsible for having large amounts of gear. One important point about that is that the scientific term for ghost gear is ALDFG, is abandoned, lost, discarded, or fishing abandoned, lost, or discarded fishing gear. An important point about ghost gear as well is that generally when gear is lost, that represents a loss to the fishers. So if you lose a net, that would otherwise be part of your toolkit, and that would be giving you revenue that should be using to catch fish. So most of the time when we find nets, they're nets that have been lost by accident. So obviously they can still cause environmental harm, but we actually want to understand the root of the problem and want to work with the fishing community to understand how we can alleviate the problem. So so part of the work we're doing is actually to conduct a workshop with the fishers to understand, what the roots of these problems are. Is it extreme weather events that are resulting in loss of gear? Why is it these particular practices that are resulting in the kind of nets that we're seeing more frequently? So we're going to kind of build on what we've done in the previous survey and try to understand what some of the roots of the problem are, and also expand the survey area, because it's been fantastic actually being able to explore so much of the Greek coast and see this for ourselves. But it has uncovered the scale of this issue. And considering that Greece has something like 16,000 kilometers of coastline, there is still a lot of work to be done.
For sure. So we actually have a viewer question.
Oh yeah.
If there are waves, can you properly see the bottom? That's a good question.
Really good question. Okay, so this depends on a few things. If it's early in the morning, waves are actually okay. The problem you get is scattering of light. So when the sun's reflecting off the surface of the water, the scattering of light makes it very difficult to see in, unless you have a polarizing lens. However, if you use a polarizing lens, it actually cuts off the angle at which light refracts from the surface of the water. Then, in theory, that means you'll be able to see straight through. But when it's wavy, that angle is changing all the time. So you only actually cut away a little bit of that angle. So after a lot of trial and error, we found a paper by Karen Joyce, who's absolute queen of marine drone mapping, alongside Versatile. And we did some work on trying to actually match up the angle of the sun, following the angle of the sun directly. And that actually by going in the same direction as the sun, you actually reduce the amount of reflectance going either way. So even if it's wavy, that reflectance is gone. So you can actually see straight down through the waves. Now, depth is another issue. If it gets too deep, it's very difficult to see. But waves, surprisingly, aren't as much of an issue as we anticipated when we began this. It's more sort of whatever's at the bottom and how clear the water is definitely the sort of limiting factor. Which is a really good question.
Yeah. Another viewer question is, what are you most excited about when it comes to your research?
Ooh, there are lots of things, and I think I'm really lucky to be working with such great people on this. In fact, actually able to have, get involved in collaborations that I really enjoy. And also the thing I've always liked about drone research is it's very versatile. So when you collect a set of imagery, you don't actually know what information you're going to be able to take from it. That's why with drone research, it's very important to be specific about exactly what you want from that information. For example, we do drone surveys all across the coast in this part of Greece. We also find that during these surveys, we see turtles. So, maybe we could do a study on the distribution of loggerhead and green turtles along that area of Greece, if possible. Maybe we could look at distribution of seagrass. We could look at the effects of plastic pollution along the beaches. There are so many really interesting tangents that could come from the data that we're collecting because it's so high resolution. But it's also quite democratizing as well, because drones like this one, its arm's being cut off. Interesting. It's underwater.
Underwater, it doesn't work.
Yeah. Put it in fresh water now. Drones are, they're pretty available. A very decent commercial drone like the one I have, maybe Pro 2, is available, and it's quite democratizing, which means that people can get involved from all walks of life, really. And it's really important to sort of develop the ability for local stakeholders in the environment or whatever sector you're working in to be able to do this themselves. So I think by developing the toolkit that we are, we could actually try to expand this tool and make it more available to people. So I think it's sort of the democratizing aspect of it, meaning that this is supposed to be open and open to collaboration, and other people want to use this for their own projects. And also the fact that there's so much interesting information that comes out of it. And as a final cherry on top, which should actually be kind of the beginning thing, I'm really enjoying this part of work as well, because we're actually retrieving the gear too. So we're going out, we're getting understanding of the distribution of all this stuff in the water. But working with ghost diving means we're actually diving. Like these guys are actual ghostbusters. We're going in and taking them out physically as well. And that's incredibly satisfying. So there's just an absolute plethora of things about this that are exciting and good.
Now, how did you become a drone flying marine biologist?
It was a interesting route. So when I was in university, I studied zoology, and I always been really passionate about animals and conservation. And I when I was in university, I listened to a talk by Lian Pin Ko from Conservation Drones. And that's a really inspiring organization. And their work is based on making drones sort of freely available and sort of creating a framework that conservation practitioners can use to study their own landscapes. And I thought this is amazing, because I've been working in ecological projects where we're searching, through sections of mud with a quadrat. It's like a 1 meter square on the ground. And we're looking to find every single individual worm or blade of grass, which is very important, very fine-grained ecological studies. But I'm sort of working in salt marsh habitats where I'm up to my neck in mud all day, thinking, wow, if we could survey this all in about 5 minutes, that would be incredibly useful. And so I started out as kind of a hobby. I worked on other ecological projects. Started working in Borneo. I finished my undergrad, and I brought a drone out with me. And we do this study on dung beetles during the day, which was very glamorous work. A lot of fun though. And in the evenings, we'd fly a drone over the forest and be amazed what we could see. We could see elephants, you could see orangutans. There's so many animals that you could see from above without disturbing them. Whereas if you're crashing through the forest, they actually tend to scatter and make themselves quite scarce. So the value of that perspective was always really important. And so based on that, I joined a PhD studying the distribution of orangutans in a area of forest where there's a lot of sort of human cohabitation and there's a lot of different human land uses. And it was during this process that I met Joel Baziuk from Global Ghost Gear Initiative, and we started talking about the potential to use these exact same methods. We used to find a nest of an orangutan on top of a tree to find a fishing net in the reef. And it worked really well. We did our first project in Myanmar, and yeah, we saw the technique works well in clear waters, and we decided that we would try to expand out. So far, we've done it as well in Belize and Jamaica, and in Maldives too, and now in Greece. So it's yeah, it's been a really kind of organic progression, and I'm enjoying the fact that we're learning so much each time we do one of these projects. So yeah, so far it's been going really well.
And it brings you to some of the most beautiful places in the world.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Not a bad job.
It's amazing wildlife. Yeah.
Another viewer question: how do you quantify the data from the transects videos made by the drone? Is there a definite methodology?
Yeah. So let's talk stats. So basically, when we do a transect, we have a single line, generally a directly straight line, and then we know that's say 1.5 kilometers. And then we can say on the day, we can see 10 meters visibility, maybe 10 to 15 meters. So you create basically a rectangle. You say anything within this range, we say is within that area, a sort of a very long, narrow strip. And then you calculate the density of all the nets you can see by looking counting all the nets you see within this strip, and then from that you can extrapolate outwards and try to see, if we look from that strip to the whole environment, how many nets are in the area we just surveyed. And we do multiple surveys to find what we call standard deviation, to actually find the difference between these individual transects and make sure it's a verifiable number. So that's how we sort of compare densities of gear we get from the aerial surveys to what we get on the transects. However, the tricky part is that you want to make sure you know exactly where the nets we find underwater are. So the first time we did this, Nikos went all the way along the Anavisos Bay, which is actually about 1.7 kilometers. And I was following him with the drone. So I was trying to see where he was going. He deploys an SMB, which is a surface marker buoy. And so it's like a long sausage kind of buoy that's lands on the surface. And whenever Nikos found a piece of net, he would send another buoy up, which is yellow. And so I'd be following him on top with the drone. And then when I see the yellow buoy, I would take a photo directly above where the buoy was. And the great thing about drones is that they have an inbuilt GPS. So if you take a picture, that records a GPS point. So I would get a GPS coordinate for every single point where the net was. And that way I could go back through the images I'd already taken, find that GPS coordinate and check whether I could see the net that he had found in his survey in my images. So we kind of verify both ways and see whether there's something that we missed from the air. So it's actually really interesting to sort of use the drone for checking as well and use it as a sort of glorified GPS. Yeah, that's really fun to sort of develop that methodology while we're in the field.
Great. We have a couple more really good questions too.
Nice.
So for marine scientists who are interested in learning drone pilot operator skills to complement their research options, what recommendations and advice would you have to help them get started? What licenses are required, etc.?
Okay, that's a really good question. It depends which country you're in. So for the UK, for example, you need to get your A2 CFC. It's very important to be licensed and to do this responsibly. There's a lot of, it's not just necessarily box ticking, it's actually really important because there's some great advice when it comes to safety. So I would say, first of all, look at your local civil aviation department and see what recommendations they have for being for using drones. Once you can see which category of drone requires a license, then you can decide for yourself whether you want to take it further and actually get that license. And I say in the meantime, if you want to try on a smaller, cheaper drone, then you can test out your flying abilities. It is a very intuitive thing to fly. And I think when you get to the larger, we call fixed wing drones, you have to sort of fly constantly. That takes a lot of effort and a lot of mental preparation and a huge amount of practice. You have to go into sort of a, not a VR, but you have to do a simulator and get really confident with doing that before you try with a real sort of plane. But with the copter, the great thing is that they have 4 propellers, and so they hover. So if you put the remote controller down, the drone will just sit there until it runs out of battery. So it's actually a very intuitive thing to learn, but you do need practice and you do need to be able to do it safely. When I started using drones, I had the Phantom 2, which doesn't even have a camera. So I was basically just flying it around and then trying to see if I could still see it and then bringing it back and then trying to not lose it. It was very unsafe, and I don't think I'd be allowed to do it today. But it was a really good way to practice until I landed in a field of sheep. But it's a really good way to sort of get your feel for it. You have to fly around and you just need some time to practice, and you will crash. Every good drone pilot crashes, so it will happen. It's okay. Yeah, just try not to crash into, you know, people or buildings. Just be in an open, safe place outdoors and enjoy, have fun.
Great. Which drone models are you using in your research? Have you adapted your drones for research in any way? Drones have limitations in some weather conditions, such as strong winds. How do you manage it? So this is all from one viewer. Let's step back to the first one. Which drone models are you using in your research?
Okay, so at the moment, I kind of been down a few different routes. So right now I'm using a DJI Mavic Pro 2. They're no longer making these, but there's a very it's a very versatile model. It's a copter, so 4 propellers and a 20 megapixel camera, and it's very steady. And that's what you want for doing stuff over the water, because it's hard to tell how windy it is when you're flying. There isn't an anemometer, there isn't a wind gauge on the drone itself directly, but you can tell from difference in forward movement how strong the wind is. So for me, this has been really reliable as a drone, and I'll be able to get really good quality images. Before I used a Phantom 4 Pro, which is also very good and a very rigid drone, so it can withstand the wind very well. But I think the battery is a little bit better on the Mavic Pro 2. And previously when I was doing forest surveying, I'd use a fixed wing drone, which is amazing. It's just one single, mine was we call a flying wing, which means it was just one single piece of polystyrene and one propeller, and it could fly for about an hour and cover up to about 60 kilometers. So it's an amazing drone to use, but very difficult to land and extremely difficult to crash. Sorry, really easy to crash, and you need a very large area to land it, because with a drone you can just land straight down. But with a fixed wing drone, you actually have to sort of take off and land like a plane. You have to actually probably land on grass and a really soft terrain, so you wouldn't grind it to bits. So it's very handy if you can use it, but you need a lot more sort of environmental requirements to actually take off. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, now, have you adapted any of them to your research?
Not necessarily. So, I mean, I don't really need to for what I'm doing, but you can. So, for example, I was using a drone called a 3DR Solo, and that's very much like a workhorse of a drone. It's a copter as well, but it has a pretty long battery life. And I used to change the camera on that. So I used to use GoPro to take what you call red, green, blue images. So just a regular image you see on the camera. But you also use a multispectral camera, which is a very large and very expensive camera. So you wouldn't want to crash it. And so we had to sort of adapt the camera we would use. But in general, I haven't needed to put anything too fancy on the drones. And actually, with the speed that drone technology is accelerating, things like a thermal camera, for example, are actually available in new models of drone already inbuilt. So it depends what you're doing. Sometimes, like some researchers, for example, in I think it was in Namibia, they're actually attaching sort of streamers on the back of drones, like a foil streamer, to stop birds of prey from attacking the drones. And there are lots of sort of different adaptations you can make. There's a researcher, Melissa Shield, who worked together on various projects. She made a mad water landing amphibious fixed wing drone. So you throw it, take it off, and it'll land onto the water. So that was a very well adapted drone, and we actually used some of their footage for one of our projects. But so from my perspective, I haven't had to adapt very much, but there's a very cool work going on to make these sort of more rugged and yeah, field worthy.
Very cool. Now, how can you scale this project up to have a global impact?
So personally, I think the key to this is empowering people working in these environments to actually use these tools themselves. So what we're doing is essentially developing a methodology that can be applied. So with the ghost gear, with working the kinks out, so we can see what's the best way you can survey marine coastal environments to identify where this gear is. Then once that's clear, I'd like to go on and actually work with other groups, work with other chapters of ghost diving to see where we can expand on where this would be useful. Because it's not for everywhere. If the water is very choppy and very murky, it's difficult to see. But in fairly clear waters, you can actually see quite a lot, and you're able to cover a very large area. So you can see even stuff that's quite close to the shore that you may not be able to, walk along and find. So it's about expanding the range you can survey effectively. Maybe you don't see every small thing that's sort of underwater, but you can see most of the large bits, and that might point you in the direction of where there is actually a larger amount of gear deeper down. So I think this is a tool that would be very useful for exploring coastal areas in terms of the pollution that's there. And I think it's important for us to develop a baseline understanding of the scale of this issue, because the ocean is extremely large and it's very difficult to know how far this problem goes. But essentially it's everywhere. And we don't really have real figures in terms of the full impact of ghost gear. So I think there's a number floating around and saying it's about 100,000 animals per year die due to being entangled in ghost gear. But we just don't know that. And it's probably much higher than that. Because how do you quantify all the nets below the water constantly caught with fish? So it's very hard to tell the scale of this issue. So I think it's important that as many researchers and individuals working in this issue have access to a tool that gives them a much sort of wider perspective. So I'd be keen to sort of try this as many places as we can and try to see what feedback we get.
Right. We have another viewer question. It says, thank you, Sol. Is it difficult to get permits to fly the drones in your study area? And does research give you an upper hand acquiring these permits compared to regular users?
So actually I have to working in Greece was an absolute blessing, because yes, it was really the first time I've worked somewhere where we had fantastic feedback from the government, from the Civil Aviation Department. Usually other projects I've waited for about, up to 6 months to get feedback, in fact, permission. But it was fantastic in Greece because there's a really good line of communication with the Civil Aviation Department, and we could actually set out the exact coordinates of where we're going to fly. And we could ask for whether this is okay. And almost within the day, we would get feedback to say this is okay. So for Greece, it was fantastic, but in general, it can be very difficult. And being a researcher doesn't necessarily make any difference. I think working with local partners is extremely important in that regard, because one thing that's referred to a lot is parachute research, which means that a researcher not from the country where the research is being done comes in, does the research, and then goes again. And then there's not much to be gained for the local the research community or stakeholders you're working with. So I think it's really important to be working directly with local stakeholders, and that being an active collaboration, you generally there's actually feedback going both ways. And part and parcel of that is generally people working on the ground know who to ask and know how to get permission. There are relationships that already exist. So I think the actually collaborating in real terms is a huge asset, and that makes a big difference when it comes to getting permits. But being a researcher, it can help sometimes, but in general you're just a number in a queue, so not really.
Okay. This project was made possible by a collaboration of various organizations and individuals who deserve credit. Let's give them a shout out here.
Absolutely. So first of all, this grant was provided by the Ocean Conservancy in the Small Grants Program and through Global Ghost Gear Initiative. So thank you very much, Ocean Conservancy, for the funds to do this project. It's been a fantastic project you're working on, and I really appreciate the support you've given us. I'd like to thank Pascal from Ghost Diving for allowing this project to happen and for all the support you've given. It's been fantastic to see how this has grown. And thank you, Nikos, from Ghost Diving Greece, for all the support, all the early morning starts and late finishes, and all the support you gave me throughout the whole course of this program. I really appreciate it. Also, thank you to the other divers on the Ghost Diving team, Jordan, Thanos, Lorena. Thanks so much for being there every day to do a lot of diving and do some long days. Also like to thank Joel Beziuk from Global Ghost Gear Initiative, and Melissa Shield for her feedback and help. And the list really goes on. There's a huge amount of people who've really helped push this project. Also, big thanks to Ramona for helping organize the talk.
Yes.
Ramona from Healthy Seed, without whom this talk wouldn't be possible. But it's been a fantastic project to be part of, and there's just a huge number of people who made this happen. Also, thanks to Vagelis as well, from Ghost Diving Greece, fantastic skipper. So my dog's come to say hello. Hey, Billy.
All right, awesome. Well, so this has been super interesting. Thank you so much. Do we have another question? Oh, no, we didn't.
Oh, brilliant.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I think, no, we already did that one. This has been super interesting. Thank you so much for your time. Good luck with the next steps of this work. It sounds really fun and really important. So keep up the good work. To our viewers, please go check out what's going on with Healthy Seas, Ghost Diving, and for today's event, the European Researchers Night. There is just a plethora of really great stuff happening. So you wanna check it out. Have a great night, everybody. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Cheers.